Hey kids, Flexing Teacher Weber here. I hope you're having a good day. We have been studying percentages over the last few days. We started off talking about what a percent is. A percent is a special fraction that compares a part to a whole out of 100. And the symbol for percent looks like this. That's the symbol we use for percentage. We talked to kids about where they've seen percentages before. Typically, a lot of kids were talking about their batteries on their phones. When they have a very low percentage and their phone, the battery is almost dead. A very high percentage, near 100%, the battery is fully charged. So we talked about some real life examples of percentages, and we started off with pictures. So what we have here is a 100 grid, 100 mini squares in this grid. And I asked the kids to tell me what fraction and percent of the grid is each color. So for example, 4 mini squares out of 100 are green, and percent is a fraction out of 100, so that means 4% are green. There are 4, 8, 12 squares that are yellow, so 12 out of 100 are yellow, or 12%. And that's how we started off. How many are orange? Well, I was counting groups of 4, 8, 12, 16, 20. So 20 out of 100 are orange, which is 20%. How many were red? Well, I'm going to count groups of 4. There's 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28. So 28 out of 100 were red, which is 28%. And then the kids went and counted the number that were purple, and they found that 36 out of 100, or 36%, were purple. So that was a visual representation of what a percent is. That's how we started off. And then the next day we did this problem. So over the big snow day weekend, Mr. Weber spent 33% of his time sleeping, 21% of his time doing chores, 6% of his time working out, 10% of his time shopping, and 10% of his time doing schoolwork. The rest of his time he was watching television. What percent of his time did he spend watching television? Well, the kids did this on their own. They recognized pretty quickly that if you're talking about Mr. Weber's entire time, you're talking about 100%. So they added up all these percentages. So 33% and 21% and 6% and 10% and 10%. They added all those up. And what they got was that this column adds up to 4, 6, so 10. Carry the 1. This column adds up to 4, 6, 7, 8. So Mr. Weber spent 80% of his time doing all those things. To figure out how much time he spent watching television, if you know the total amount of his time is 100%, you can subtract the 80% he spent doing other things, and it's 20% of his time that was spent watching television. So that's the next thing we did. After that, we started talking about fractions, decimals, and percents, relating them all together, including what they look like as a picture. So we started off with the important, what I would call benchmark percents, the ones that the kids should just know off by heart. So the fraction 1/2, if we're talking about this hundreds grid, well, if we're talking about a half of the squares would be shaded in, like that. And so another way of thinking of that fraction is 50 out of 100. And 50 out of 100 we would know is 50%. And then also as a decimal, 2 zeros on 100 means you'd have 2 decimal spots where we would put the 5 and the 0 So we could also think of this decimal as 50 hundredths, or we could just think of it as 5 tenths because there are 5 of these tenth strips shaded. So we started off with the fraction 1/2. Kids need to recognize that that's 50%. Then we did another benchmark fraction, 1/4. We might not be able to picture 1/4 on this hundreds grid yet, but what the kids have learned how to do in the past is make an equivalent fraction. So what would 1/4 look like on this hundreds grid? Well, let's make a fraction out of 100. And to go from 4 to 100, we multiply by 25. We do the same thing to the top, and that's 25 out of 100. The kids would know that that's now, percent is a fraction out of 100, so that's 25%. And 25 out of 100 has 2 decimal spots, which would have a 2 and a 5. And that's another benchmark fraction we have to know, 1/4. And 1/4 is 25%, 25 squares out of 100. And then the third benchmark fraction we needed to know was 3/4. And we can do the same thing as before. What does 3/4 looks like on a hundreds grid? Well, let's make it a fraction out of 100, an equivalent. We can get 4 to be 100 by timesing by 25. And since we're making an equivalent, we would do the same thing to the top. And 3 times 25 is 75. 75 out of 100 means that's 75%. And 2 zeros on 100 means 2 decimal spots, where we would have 7 tenths and 5 hundredths for 0 and 75 hundredths, which means we'd have 75 squares shaded in. And 5 right there. So those are the 3 benchmarks the kids have to know. They have to know 1/2, 1/4, 3/4. They should know those ones for sure. Then we started looking at some other fractions. Well, the fraction 55 out of 100. Well, what would that look like on a hundreds grid? Well, it would look like 55 mini squares shaded. Something like that. And as a decimal, 2 zeros on 100 would mean 55 hundredths. And as a percent, 55 out of 100 means 55%. And then to take it a step further, I've been having the kids see if they can make a simpler version of the fraction. You do that by finding the largest number that will divide in the numerator and denominator. So if kids are really down with their factors, they will recognize you could divide the numerator and denominator by 5, and a simpler form of this fraction is 11 over 20. So that's what we've been working on today, all the different ways we can represent a fraction. You can do it as a picture, as a decimal, as a percent. Okay, so we did another one, 6 out of 100. And we would recognize that that's a pretty small fraction, right? That's only 6 squares shaded in. So as a decimal, that would have 2 zeros. So it would have 2 decimal spots, and we'd have 6 in the hundredth spot. 6 out of 100 means that that's 6%. And if you're trying to get this fraction as simple as it can be, you can divide the numerator and denominator by 2. They're both even numbers, so you can divide by 2. And the simpler form of that fraction is 3 over 50. It's all the different ways you can write that percent. So we went from there, and then what we started doing is we started off with a decimal this time. Well, what would that look like as a fraction? Well, 2 decimal spots means that the fraction has to be out of 100. 2 decimal spots means 2 zeros, and that would be 24 out of 100. Well, immediately 24 out of 100 means I'm going to shade in 24 squares. And as a percent, 24 out of 100 would be 24%. And then for a real challenge, if you want to get the simplest form of this fraction, you could divide the numerator and denominator by 4, or you could divide it by 2 twice, and you would get 6 on top and 25 on the bottom for the simplest form of that fraction. Let's look at another one. So same idea here, 0 and 5/10. Well, 2 decimal spots means the fraction will have 2 zeros and a 1 in front. And this means it'll be 5 on top, 5 out of 100. Well, 5 out of 100 means 5 squares shaded out of 100. 5 out of 100 means that that's 5%. The simplest form of this fraction, we could divide the numerator and denominator by 5. I know 5 times 5 is 1, and 5 times 20 is 100. So all the different ways we can represent numbers that aren't one whole. And then we did another one, but this time we started with a percent. Well, if we know 62%, we know the fraction must be 62 out of 100. Because percent means out of 100. If we know that, we know that 2 zeros on 100 means 2 decimal spots, which would be filled by a 6 and a 2 and a 0 in front. If we know 62 out of 100, we know that there has to be 62 squares shaded. And then for the real challenge, what's the simplest form of this fraction? Well, they're both even numbers. Divide by 2, divide by 2, and that would be 31 over 50. All the different ways we can write numbers that aren't whole numbers. Fraction, decimal, percent, picture. Last one. What if you start with 1%? Well, percent means a fraction out of 100. So that would be 1 out of 100. That would mean 1 lonely little square shaded out of 100. That would mean 2 zeros on the fraction means your decimal has to have 2 decimal spots. You need to have 1/100th. So 1 in the 100th spot, 0 and a 0 in front. This fraction is as simple as it can be. The assignment I had the kids do today was do exactly what we were just doing. I've given them some numbers. They have to represent them on the grid. They have to represent them as a fraction, decimal, percent. And they have to, I really like them for a challenge, try to make the fraction in simplest form if they can. There's 2 sides to this page. That's due for tomorrow. I hope that helps. That's all for now. Flexing Teacher Weber, out.